What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph and welcome back to Casually Competitive MTG. In today's video, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to try to draft a box of Commander Legends. I say draft because unfortunately, due to COVID restrictions, we haven't been able to meet up recently, so we can't do an actual draft even though this set is made to be able to be drafted. So what we did is we took all of the packs in the box, split them up, and then everyone just kind of took them home and we opened them on stream and we built a deck from those packs only. So it's more of like a sealed kind of format, but we are following all of the draft rules. The only difference is the way we're opening packs. So unfortunately, it's not a pure and true draft experience, but it's the closest we could get under the given circumstances. I want to give a special shout out to TCG Player for sending us a box of Commander Legends. They were nice enough to send us a box so we could give this a shot. So if you're looking to pick up Magic cards, either from Commander Legends or just any card in general, click on our TCG affiliate link in the description before you do. It helps us out at no cost to you and also lets them know that we sent you there. If you're looking for other ways to support us, we have a Patreon and a merch store. Links are in the description for that. We also have an affiliate with Alter Sleeves. If you're looking to pick up some art for your cards without having to get them physically altered, be sure to check out Alter Sleeves using the link in our description. We also have an affiliate with Flipside Gaming, where if you use our code CasuallyMTG at checkout, you will get 10% off of eligible purchases, and you'll also be directly helping us. Now, with that all out of the way, let's get into how the decks are constructed for this draft game of Commander Legends. Bill went first in this game, and out of the commanders that he pulled in his packs, he decided to go with Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator, and Tevesh Szat, Doom of Fools. Bill chose these commanders as they provided a good deal of card draw and a good deal of chump blockers to protect his board with Tevesh, and a good amount of ramp with Malcolm. Tevesh also provided for a possible win condition, which with a limited card pool is something that can be incredibly valuable. After choosing these commanders, Bill focused on choosing cards from his card pool that synergized well with Malcolm's Pirate Claws, good removal cards, and defensive or control-based auras. And finally, he rounded out this deck with just some value engines, cards that would let him draw cards or scry frequently, so cards like Seer's Lantern, Sunset Pyramid, and Frasira Seer made the cut. Bill's opening hand contained 2 islands, a swamp, a preordain, a sunset pyramid, a deranged assistant, and a prosperous pirates. I went second in this game, and since we streamed this whole event, we decided to let the chat pick and partially build one of the decks, and I drew the short straw. I got the opportunity to be piloting this deck. Out of the commanders that I pulled, chat decided to go with Amareth the Lustrous, which honestly, all things considered, wasn't a terrible choice. I got fairly unlucky with the commanders that I pulled, and this was probably honestly one of the better ones, as it provided a solid flying body in the command zone as well as a decent value engine that would let me refill my hand. The colors also worked well for what I pulled, so after choosing this commander, we decided to go on a theme that just revolved around ramping hard, since we pulled quite a few artifact ramp pieces. So cards like Finthorn Elves, Commander Sphere, and a Rootweaver Druid made the first cut, and we used this ramp to filter into big creatures that we could use to kind of take control of the board, and it just so happened that we hit quite a few creatures with Cascade, so that ended up kind of being our sub-theme. Cards like Annoyed Altasaur or Suicune Recluse kind of rounded out this deck. With the creatures established, we did our best to fill out the rest of the deck with control pieces. Unfortunately, just due to what we pulled, we didn't get a ton of good removal, but we did have cards like Fall from Favor and Crushing Vines that, although they're expensive, would help protect us a little bit if we needed them. My opening hand contained a forest, an island, 2 plains, a Commander Sphere, a Rootweaver Druid, and a Maelstrom Colossus. Going next was Nate, and the commander that he chose out of his selection pool was Jared Carthalion True Heir. After seeing all of cards that he pulled, Nate decided to go with Jared as the commander for his deck because he felt like with the cards that he had, he could build a decent Naya good stuff style of deck. The deck he built has a heavy concentration of creatures in order to constantly and quickly regain Monarch after giving it to someone else with Jared, and he also included a lot of evasive life gain creatures to do the same and also keep his life total high. On top of this, he had a few token generators and a few +1/+1 synergies just to keep his board healthy and discourage other people from blocking. Cards like Prava of the Steel Legion and Lethiel the Bounteous Dawn were some really big cards that were slotted in this deck and built around. Nate's opening hand contained a command tower, 2 forests, a plains, a burnished heart, a promise of tomorrow, and a fertilid. And finally, going last in this game was Adam. Adam, knowing that this game would be probably a much slower and grindier game than the games we normally play, decided to pick a commander that would compensate that fairly well, so he went with Liesa, Shroud of Dusk. The flying life-linking body works well to protect his own life total, and it's easy to recast if removed since he can pay life to pay the commander tax. But most importantly, this commander just being on the battlefield puts a time limit on the game since Liesa will be passively dealing damage as everyone else is just playing Magic the Gathering. Unfortunately, due to the cards that he pulled and being restricted to 2 colors, he didn't have a huge card selection for supporting cards, but he was able to slot in some decent big hitters like Court of Ambition and a Chrome as well as some good artifacts and cards to pump up his commander to keep his life total healthy. Adam's opening hand contained 2 plains, a swamp, a Prophetic Prism, a Corpse Churn, a Seer's Lantern, and a Slaughter the Strong. Remember, if you want to watch these games live, we stream them weekly to our Twitch channel, link is in the description, and if you're looking at picking up some Commander Legends cards, be sure to click on our TCG Player affiliate link before you do. They were nice enough to send us this box, and if you're going to be buying cards anyway, click on that link to let them know that we sent you. With that all being said, with the intro out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. Bill starts off this game by playing an island as his land, and then tapping that island to cast a Preordain. He scries 2 cards to the bottom, draws a card, and passes to Joseph. Joseph draws, plays a forest, and then ships the turn to Nate. Nate draws, and as his land, plays a Terramorphic Expanse, and with nothing left, gives the turn to Adam. Adam draws, plays a swamp, and continuing the trend, also just immediately passes the turn. Bill starts off his second turn by untapping, playing a swamp as his land for turn, and then tapping for 2 mana to cast a Deranged Assistant. In response, Nate cracks his Terramorphic Expanse to search up a tapped mountain to the battlefield, and then the assistant resolves and Bill passes to Joseph. Joseph untaps, plays an island as his land, and then passes to Nate. Nate untaps, plays a command tower, and then with nothing left, gives a turn to Adam. Adam untaps, plays a plains, and then taps for 2 mana to cast a Prophetic Prism. When it enters the battlefield, he draws a card, and with nothing left, he ships the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, plays an island as his land, and then taps his assistant to mill a card and add a colorless mana, and uses this mana to help cast a Sisay's Ring. He then taps the Sisay's Ring to help cast a Sunset Pyramid, and with nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph plays a plains as his land, and then taps for 3 mana to cast a Command Sphere. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, plays a forest, and then taps his mana to cast a Fertilid. The Fertilid resolves, and then Nate gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, plays a plains, and then taps his mana to cast a Seer's Lantern, and with nothing left, gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, plays a swamp, and then taps his mana to cast one of his partner commanders, Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator. He decides that he likes Adam's play, so he follows this up by casting his own Seer's Lantern, and then with nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, plays a forest as his land, and then for 2 mana casts an Omen Speaker. When it enters the battlefield, he scries 2 cards to the bottom, and then he taps for 3 mana to cast a Root Weaver Druid, trying to push this game along. Everyone is tempted by the Druid and decides to search up 3 lands, so Joseph gets 3 basics to the battlefield, and everybody else gets 2. And just so you know, Joseph gets a mountain and 2 swamps, while everyone else actually gets lands that they want. With nothing left, Joseph gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps his permanents, plays a plains as his land for turn, and then retaps some of his mana to cast a Promise of Tomorrow. He then, with nothing left, gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, plays a swamp, and then taps his mana to cast his commander, Liesa, Shroud of Dusk. He then goes to pass the turn to Bill, and on Adam's end step, Bill uses his assistant to mill a card and add a colorless mana to help activate Sunset Pyramid, removing a brick counter and drawing a card. Bill then goes to his turn, untaps, and then in his first main phase, taps his mana to cast his other partner commander, Tevesh Szat, Doom of Fools, which, if you know anything about us as people, well, let's just say we wouldn't last long against Tevesh. Anyway, on cast, Bill takes 2 from Liesa, and when it resolves, Bill activates its +2 ability to generate 2 Thralls. He then plays a swamp as his land for turn, and then goes to combat and swings Malcolm at Joseph. Joseph declares no blockers, takes 2 damage, and Bill creates a treasure token. In Bill's second main phase, he uses his mana to cast a Fleshbag Marauder. In response to this cast, Nate taps his mana and removes a counter from Fertilid in order to get a basic land to the battlefield. Once that ability resolves, Adam taps for 2 mana to cast a Raise the Alarm, creating 2 1/1 soldiers. Liesa's ability then resolves, Bill takes 2, and Fleshbag then resolves, enters the battlefield, Joseph sacrifices his druid, Nate his Fertilid, Adam one of his soldiers, and Bill his Fleshbag. Bill then goes to his end step to pass the turn, and on his end step, Nate's Promise of Tomorrow triggers, and it gets sacrificed in order to bring his Fertilid back to the battlefield. Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, plays an island as his land, and then for 2 mana casts a Marble Diamond, losing 2 life to Liesa when it's cast, and with nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, plays a forest as his land, and then taps his mana to cast a Burnished Heart. On casts, he loses 2 life, it resolves, and Nate then passes to Adam. Adam untaps and then immediately goes to combat. He declares his commander as an attacker at Tevesh. In response, Bill casts a Spontaneous Mutation targeting Adam's commander. He takes 2 damage on cast, and the X is equal to 4 since he has 4 cards in his graveyard. The aura then resolves, Liesa does a total of 1 damage to Tevesh, and Adam gains 1 from the lifelink. In his second main phase, Adam casts a Feast of Succession, taking 2 damage on cast. In response, Bill mills 1 with his assistant to help generate enough mana to activate Sunset Pyramid. When the ability resolves, still in response to Feast of Succession, Nate taps his mana to activate both his Burnished Heart and his Fertilid to get a total of 3 basic lands to the battlefield. He searches them up, the Feast of Succession resolves, the board is basically cleared, and Adam becomes the Monarch. Adam then goes to his end step to pass the turn, and he draws a card from being the Monarch. Bill then goes to his turn, untaps, plays a swamp as his land, and then taps his mana to cast an Azure Fleet Admiral. He loses 2 on cast, and when it resolves, he becomes the Monarch. He then activates Tevesh's +2 ability to create 2 more Thralls, and he then recasts his commander Malcolm for 5 mana, losing 2 life to Liesa on cast. He then goes to his end step since he is the Monarch that triggers, and in response, Joseph taps his mana to flash out a Sweet Gum Recluse. He loses 2 on cast, and on cast it also cascades. He cascades into a Sailor of Means, which he decides to cast, losing 2 when it is cast, and when it enters the battlefield he makes a treasure token. The Sweet Gum Recluse then resolves, and he decides to put 3 +1/+1 counters on itself, as well as the Sailor of Means. Bill then draws his card from being the Monarch, and Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, plays a Plains as his land, and then taps for 8 mana to cast a Maelstrom Colossus, taking 2 damage on cast. He cascades into an Armillary Sphere, which he decides to cast, losing 2 more life, and the Maelstrom Colossus then resolves. He then goes to combat and swings both his Sweet Gum Recluse and his Sailor of Means at Bill. Bill chumps both of them with his 2 Thralls, and in his second main phase, Joseph taps for a blue mana to cast a Preordain. He takes 2 damage on cast, and he scries both of the cards to the bottom, draws a card, and then passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, plays a forest as his land, and then taps his mana to cast his commander, Jared Carthalion True Heir, losing 2 on cast. When it resolves and enters the battlefield, he makes Adam the Monarch, and he follows this up by casting Lethiel the Bounteous Dawn, losing 2 more life when it is cast. Once this resolves, he decides to pass the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, plays a swamp as his land, and then taps his mana to cast a Slaughter the Strong. It resolves, and everyone chooses what creatures they will save with total power 4 or less. Adam decides to save nothing, allowing his commander to die. Bill keeps Malcolm, Joseph keeps his Sweet Gum Recluse, and Nate keeps Lethiel. Adam then follows this up by recasting his commander, losing 2 life instead of paying the additional mana, and he then goes to pass the turn, and since he is the Monarch, he draws a card. Still in Adam's end step, Bill activates his Sunset Pyramid to remove another brick counter and draw another card. With nothing left, Bill then goes to his turn, untaps, and then retaps some of his mana to cast a Vow of Torment, targeting Liesa. He loses 2 on cast, it then resolves, and he follows this up by activating Tevesh's +2 ability to make 2 more Thralls. He then casts a Daring Saboteur, losing 2 more life on casts, and follows this up by casting a Kite Sail Skirmisher, losing 2 more. He then goes to combat and again swings Malcolm at Joseph. Joseph declares no blockers, and when Malcolm deals the damage, Bill creates a treasure token. With nothing left, Bill passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps and starts off his turn by paying 2 mana to crack his Armillary Sphere to get 2 forests to his hand. He then taps for 6 mana to cast his commander, Amareth the Lustrous, taking 2 on cast. He follows this up by playing a forest as his land for turn, looking at the top card of his library, and putting it back without revealing it. He then goes to combat, and in response to moving to combat, Nate casts Ancient Animus, targeting Lethiel. It gets pumped up and he makes it fight Bill's Saboteur. The damage is done, Nate gains 3 from the lifelink, and Joseph then continues to combat and swings Sweet Gum Recluse at Tevesh. Bill chumps with one of his thralls, and Joseph then goes to pass the turn to Nate, and on Joseph's end step, Nate decides to not distribute the counters with Lethiel, even though he had gained life. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, plays a Plains Ass's land, and then taps his mana to recast his commander, Jared. He takes 2 on cast, and when it resolves and enters the battlefield, he makes Joseph the Monarch. He then goes to combat and swings Lethiel at Tevesh. Bill chumps with a Thrall, Nate gains 3 life from the lifelink, and in his second main phase, he taps his mana to cast a Prava of the Steel Legion, losing 2 on cast. He then goes to pass the turn to Adam, and on Nate's end step, Nate puts 3 +1/+1 counters on Jared from the life he had gained and Lethiel's ability. Adam then goes to his turn, untaps, plays a swamp as his land, and then immediately goes to combat, swinging his commander at Joseph. In response to moving to blocks, Joseph taps for 3 mana to cast a Crushing Vines, targeting Adam's commander. There are no responses, Adam's commander dies, and Adam then goes to his second main phase where he casts a Faith's Fetters, targeting Bill's Tevesh. It resolves and Adam ends his turn by recasting his commander yet again, this time paying 4 life, and on his end step, Bill taps his mana to scry with his Sunset Pyramid. Bill then goes to his turn, untaps, plays a swamp as his land, and then taps his mana to cast a Prosperous Pirates, losing 2 on cast, and when it enters the battlefield, making 2 treasure tokens. He then goes to pass the turn to Joseph, and on his end step, Joseph for 2 mana flashes out an Ambush Viper. When it enters the battlefield, he looks at the top card of his library from his commander and reveals an Annoyed Altasaur and puts it into his hand. Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, plays a forest as his land, and when that forest enters the battlefield, looks at the top card and leaves it on top. He then taps his mana to cast the Annoyed Altasaur, taking 2 on cast, and it cascades into an Entourage of Trest. He decides to cast this creature, losing 2, and he then goes to combat and swings a total of 6 damage at Adam, and he swings 2 damage, the 2/1 Death Touch Snake, at Tevesh. No blockers are declared, the damage is dealt, and Joseph goes to pass the turn to Nate, and on his end step, he draws a card from being the Monarch, and still in his end step, Nate taps his mana in order to activate Prava to create a 1/1 soldier. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, and then taps for 4 to cast a Seraph of Dawn, losing 2 on cast, and with nothing left, passing the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, plays a Plains as his land, and then taps his mana to cast an Eyeblight Callers. He loses 2 on cast, and he follows this up by casting a Fleshbag Marauder, losing 2 more on cast. In response, Bill uses his Seer's Lantern to scry a card, which he scries to the bottom, and Fleshbag Marauder then resolves and enters the battlefield. Adam sacrifices his Eyeblight Callers, Bill his Prosperous Pirates, Joseph the Ambush Viper, and Nate one of his tokens. Adam then continues to combat and swings his commander at Bill. Bill double blocks Adam's commander with his own commander and the Kite Sail Skirmisher, and when all is said and done, all creatures are destroyed and Adam gains 5 from the lifelink. With nothing left, Adam passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and in his first main phase recasts his commander Malcolm. He then taps his mana and exiles the Kite Sail Skirmisher in order to encore it, creating 3 token copies of that creature. He then goes to combat, and one of the tokens goes at each opponent. Joseph and Nate both safely block, and Adam declares no blockers and takes the damage. When the damage is dealt, Bill creates 1 treasure token from Malcolm's trigger, and in his second main phase, he casts a Cast Down, targeting Joseph's Annoyed Altasaur. Cast Down resolves, and Bill goes to pass the turn to Joseph, and on Bill's end step, since Nate gained life this turn since he blocked with his Seraph of Dawn, he puts 2 +1/+1 counters on Seraph from Lethiel's ability. Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, plays an island as his land, and off of the top of his library reveals a Plains due to his commander, which he puts into his hand. He then for 1 mana casts a Findhorn Elves, with nothing to reveal from his commander, and he then goes to combat and swings his commander at Nate. Nate declares no blockers, takes 6 damage, and Joseph then goes to pass the turn to Nate, and on his end step, since he's a Monarch, he draws a card, and still in his end step, Nate pays 8 mana to create 2 1/1 soldier tokens with Prava. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, and immediately goes to combat, swinging 3 damage at Bill and 8 damage at Joseph. Bill declares no blockers, Joseph blocks all of the creatures attacking him, and when all is said and done, the Findhorn Elves dies, and Nate gains 7 from the lifelink. In his second main phase, Nate taps his mana to cast a Scaled Behemoth, and with nothing left, he goes to pass the turn to Adam, and on Nate's end step, since he gains 7 life, he puts 5 +1/+1 counters on Jared, and 2 +1/+1 counters on Seraph of Dawn. Still in this end step, Adam casts a Corpse Churn, getting Ardent Intrepid Archaeologists back to his hand. Adam then goes to his turn, untaps, and then taps his mana to cast this Ardent. He then casts a Spark Harvest, sacrificing one of his tokens as an additional cost to target Lethiel. It resolves, Nate's creatures is destroyed, and still in the first main phase, Adam taps his mana to recast his commander, this time paying 6 life. He then goes to combat, and due to Ardent's ability, he puts Faith's Fetters onto Prava rather than Tevesh. In response to this, Nate taps his mana to generate 1 soldier. He then continues to his end step and passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, and before he draws, he taps his mana to activate Seer's Lantern in order to scry. He scries a card to the bottom. Still before his draw, he does the same thing with Sunset Pyramid, again scrying to the bottom. He then draws his card for turn and goes to combat, swinging his commander at Nate. Nate declares no blockers, takes 2 damage, and when the damage is dealt, Bill creates a treasure token. In his second main phase, he activates Tevesh's +1 ability, sacking Malcolm and drawing 3 cards. He then taps his mana to cast a Nadir's Nightblade, on cast losing 2, and he follows this up by casting a Vasira Seer, losing 2 on cast. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, plays a forest as his land, and when it enters the battlefield, looks at the top card of his library but has nothing to reveal. He then taps his mana to cast a Spectral Searchlight, losing 2 on cast due to Adam's commander, and off the top of his library reveals another Spectral Searchlight. He then taps his commander sphere for a green mana and sacrifices it in order to draw a card. He then taps for 2 additional mana to help cast a Fall from Favor, targeting Jared. He loses 2 on cast, and when it resolves, Jared gets tapped down. He then goes to combat and swings his commander at Adam. Adam declares no blockers, takes 6 damage, and Joseph goes to pass the turn to Nate, and on Joseph's end step, since he's a monarch, he draws a card. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, and then goes to combat and swings a total of 12 damage at Joseph. Joseph blocks a soldier and the behemoth with his entourage, since he's the monarch, and he can block 2 creatures with the entourage, and he blocks a soldier with the recluse. In response to moving to damage, Bill sacrifices a treasure, draining the table for 1, gaining 1 life, to help cast a Blade Brand, giving the entourage Death Touch. On cast, he loses 2. It then resolves. The entourage gets Death Touch. It dies along with the behemoth and the soldier it was blocking. And Joseph then takes 2 damage from the unblocked soldier, and Nate becomes the monarch. In his second main phase, Nate taps his mana to cast an Iona's Judgment, targeting Faith's Fetters. On cast, he loses 2. It resolves, and it destroys Faith's Fetters. Nate then goes to his end step, and since he's the monarch, he draws a card. Adam goes to his turn, untaps, and before he draws, he activates Seer's Lantern in order to scry a card, which he scries to the top. He then draws a card, and in his first main phase, casts an Amorphous Axe, losing 2 on cast. He then goes to combat, and with Arden, he puts the axe onto his commander. He then swings his commander at Joseph. Joseph decides to block with his Reaching Recluse, takes no damage, and Adam then passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, and before he draws, he scries a card to the top with his Sunset Pyramid. He then draws a card for turn, and in his first main phase, taps his mana to cast a Strategic Planning, losing 2 on cast. He then plays an island as his land, and then follows this up by activating Tevesh's +2 ability to make 2 thralls. With nothing left, he passes to Joseph. Joseph untaps, and then taps for 1 mana to cast a Universal Solvent. He loses 2 on cast, and when it enters the battlefield, he reveals nothing off of his commander. He then plays an island as his land for turn, and when that enters the battlefield, he reveals a forest from the top of his library. He then goes to his end step to pass the turn to Nate, and in Joseph's end step, Nate taps his mana to create 2 soldier tokens with Prava. In response to the second activation, Joseph pays 7 mana and cracks his Solvent in order to target Adam's commander to destroy it. Adam's commander is then destroyed, and still in response to the second activation, Bill casts a Ghastly Demise, targeting Prava. Prava is then destroyed, the 2 tokens are then created, and Nate then goes to his turn. On his turn, Nate untaps and then retaps for some mana to cast a Jenska's Will. It resolves, and since he has his commander, he gets both modes, so he generates 4 red mana and exiles a forest, a Cage of Hands, and a Gift of Paradise, and he then immediately plays the forest as his land for turn. He then casts the Gift of Paradise, gaining 4 when it enters the battlefield, enchanting a forest. He then casts a Cage of Hands, targeting Joseph's commander. He then goes to combat and swings 7 damage at Tevesh and his commander at Joseph. Since Joseph cannot block, he declares no blockers. Bill also declares no blockers, and before the damage is dealt, Nate taps his mana to return Cage of Hands to his hand. The damage is then dealt, Joseph is dealt enough damage to lose the game, and Tevesh takes 7. In his second main phase, Nate taps his mana to cast a Farhaven Elf, getting a basic forest to the battlefield tapped when the Farhaven Elf enters the battlefield. Nate then goes to his end step, and in his end step, draws a card from being the Monarch, and still in his end step, Adam casts a Sky Whaler's Shot, targeting the Seraph of Dawn. It resolves, and still before the end step ends, Adam activates his Seer's Lantern in order to scry a card to the bottom. Adam then goes to his turn, untaps, and in his first main phase, plays a Plains as his land for turn, and he then taps his mana to recast his commander, this time losing 8 life. He then goes to combat, and Arden's ability equips the axe to his commander. Adam does not attack anyone, and then goes to his end step, and in his end step, Bill sacrifices his Thrall to Viscera Seer to scry a card to the bottom and drain the table for 1, gaining 1 life. He then sacrifices his other Thrall to do the same thing, again scrying the card to the bottom and draining the table. Bill then goes to his turn, untaps, plays a Swamp as his land, and then taps his mana to cast a Jalun Tome. He takes 2 damage on cast, and he then immediately pays 2 mana and taps it in order to loot, drawing a card and discarding 1. He then activates Tevesh's +2 ability to create 2 more Thralls, and with nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and immediately goes to combat, swinging 4 1/1s at Bill and Jared at Adam. Bill blocks 3 of these 1/1s, 2 with a Thrall and 1 with his 1/3, and Adam blocks Jared with 1 of his 1/1 tokens. Before the damage is dealt, Bill sacrifices both of his Thralls to scry 2 cards to the bottom, and in doing so drains the table twice. The damage is then dealt, Jared gets a +1/+1 counter from the damage that was dealt, and in his second main phase, Nate casts Cage of Hands, targeting Liesa, losing 2 on cast. He then casts a Wild Celebrants, again losing 2 from Liesa, and when it enters a battlefield, he targets Bill's Tome. The Tome is destroyed, Nate goes to pass the turn, and since he's Amareth, he draws a card, and still in Nate's end step, Adam activates Seer's Lantern in order to scry a card, and he scries to the bottom. Adam then goes to his turn, untaps, and before he draws, he activates Seer's Lantern again and scries a card to the bottom. He then draws for turn, and with nothing to do, he goes to his end step to pass the turn, and in his end step, Bill activates his Sunset Pyramid to scry a card, which he scries to the bottom. Bill then goes to his turn, untaps, and before draw, activates Sunset Pyramid again in order to scry a card to the bottom, and then he follows this up by activating Seer's Lantern, again scrying a card to the bottom. He then finally draws a card for turn, plays an island, and then activates Tevesh's +2 ability to create 2 more Thralls. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, plays an Opal Palace as his land, and he then taps his mana to cast a Court Street Denzian, losing 2 on cast. He then goes to combat and swings 4 1/1s and a 5/3 at Bill, and he swings Jared at Adam. Bill throws the Thralls in front of the biggest creature, and Adam puts a token in front of Jared. Before damage is dealt, Bill again sacrifices both of his Thralls to Viscera Seer, scrying 2 cards to the bottom and draining the table twice. Nate then goes to his end step, and since he's a Monarch, he draws a card. Adam then goes to his turn, and before he draws, he activates Seer's Lantern in order to scry a card to the bottom. And he then draws a card, and with nothing to do, just passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, and in his first main phase, casts a Cast Down, targeting Wild Celebrants. He loses 2 on cast, and when it resolves and destroys Wild Celebrants, he then taps for 7 mana to cast a Sandstone Oracle. On cast, he loses 2, and since Adam has 2 cards in hand and Bill has 0, when it enters the battlefield, Bill draws 2 cards. Bill then casts Spark Harvest, paying the extra mana, targeting Jared. Spark Harvest resolves, Jared is destroyed, and Bill then activates Tevesh's +2 ability to create 2 more Thralls. He then goes to his end step, and in his end step, Nate pays 2 mana to return Cage of Hands to his hand, and still in the end step, he pays 2 mana to flash out an Ambush Viper, losing 2 on cast. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, and in his first main phase, he casts Cage of Hands, targeting Sandstone Oracle, losing 2 on cast from Liesa. He then uses Opal Palace to help recast his commander, and since it's the 3rd time his commander has been cast, Jared enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters. When it enters the battlefield, he also taps down Bill's 1/3 from his Court Street Denzian, and he also makes Adam the Monarch. He then goes to combat and swings all of his available creatures at Bill. Bill blocks the 2 biggest creatures, each with a Thrall, and before damage is dealt, he again sacrifices both of his Thralls to Viscera to scry 2 cards to the bottom, drain the table twice, and then he takes 3 damage. In his second main phase, Nate pays 2 mana to return Cage of Hands to his hand, and then recasts Cage of Hands to target Adam's commander. He loses 2 on cast, and when it resolves, he passes the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, and before he draws, he activates Seer's Lantern in order to scry a card, which he scries to the bottom. He then goes to his end step immediately, and since he is the Monarch, he draws a card. Bill then goes to his turn, untaps, and before he draws, he scries with Sunset's Pyramid, which he scries to the bottom, and he then scries with Seer's Lantern, and this time he decides to keep it on top. He then draws that card, and in his first main phase, he casts Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. On cast, he loses 2, and when it enters the battlefield, he decides to copy the 1/3 Nadir's Nightblade. He then activates Tevesh's +2 ability to create 2 more Thralls, and he then goes to his end step, and on his end step, Nate pays 2 mana to return Cage of Hands to his hand. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, and in his first main phase, casts Kodama of the East Tree, taking 2 on cast. He then casts a Crimson Fleet Commodore, again losing 2, and when it enters the battlefield, he becomes the Monarch. Also, when it enters the battlefield, Kodama triggers and he puts a Cage of Hands onto the battlefield, and he has it target Sandstone Oracle. He then goes to combat and full swings again at Tevesh. Bill blocks the 2 biggest creatures with his Thralls, and he blocks 2 additional 1/1s with his 1/3s. Again, in response to moving to damage, he sacrifices his Thralls to Viscera and again scries 2 cards to the bottom and drains the table twice, and since he has 2 drainers now, it does enough damage to take Adam out of the game. Tevesh then takes the damage, and Nate, with nothing left to do, goes to his end step, draws a card from being the Monarch, and passes the turn to Bill. Bill goes to his turn, untaps, and in his first main phase, activates Tevesh's +2 ability to create 2 more Thralls. He then taps his mana to cast a Skilled Animator, making his Seer's Lantern now a 5/5 artifact creature. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, and in his first main phase, returns Cage of Hands to his hand. He then recasts it to target Seer's Lantern to not allow it to block or attack. He then taps his mana to cast an Intangible Virtue, and then goes to combat and full swings at Tevesh. Bill chumps the 2 biggest with his Thralls, again sacrificing them to drain the table, well, in this case, just Nate, and he then lets the rest of the damage go through, and Tevesh dies. Nate then goes to his end step, draws a card from being the Monarch, and Bill uses his mana to activate Seer's Lantern to scry a card to the bottom. Bill then goes to his turn, and before he draws, he scries a card with Seer's Lantern, this time keeping it on top. He then casts a Corpse Churn, returning the Daring Saboteur to his hand. He then recasts Tevesh from his command zone and activates its +2 ability to create 2 Thralls. He then goes to combat and swings a total of 6 damage at Nate, and since Nate has no more blockers, Nate takes 6, which coincidentally is exactly how much life he had, so Bill then wins the game. Well, we hope you enjoyed a little bit of a different game. This was definitely much different from normal, and don't expect to see this too often. It was just something we really wanted to try. When Commander Legends was announced, we thought it'd be really fun to just draft something. We've never really drafted anything before, since we're primarily Commander players. Unfortunately, COVID restrictions were a little bit too strict for us to do the actual draft, but it was still a really fun time just kind of streaming the whole deck building process and having to be very limited on the cards that that we were able to add. It was a much more casual game, and it did remind me why I haven't played casual Commander in probably 2 or 3 years, but it was a really cool one-off experiment just to try out and see how it was. That being said, as a quick post-game recap, I gotta say Liesa was an absolute all-star this game. Without Liesa, I think this game would have had to grind out another hour or so, just based on the card selection that we got. I don't know if we got unlucky or not, but there seemed to be very few big hitters or win condition cards in the packs that we had gotten. So unless we got unlucky, I feel like without Liesa, this game might have dragged on quite a bit more. That being said, Liesa had a huge impact in this game, just destroying life totals from the get-go, from the moment she was cast. And even after all of the answers and removals, it still came back and just continued to be a constant looming passive threat to everyone, draining Bill's and myself life total very low, allowing Nate to kind of capitalize. And at the end, Nate kind of became arch enemy to a point, and I think he just kind of spun his wheels a little bit, couldn't find the right creatures or pieces he needed, and Bill was able to just outvalue with blockers. But I think in general, Liesa just commanded this game and really steered it in the direction that it ended up going. But that being said, that is all we have for you for this video. Hopefully you guys did enjoy it. If you didn't, we'll be back to our normal content with the next video, so you can be looking forward to that. That all being said, that is all we have. We hope you enjoyed this video. I am Joseph. This is Casually Competitive MTG, and we will see you next time.